So in our first three parts, we talked about the factions of the Ironborn and how Euron is likely tied up in the Mirri's knot. At minimum, we know he was in Slaver's Bay watching Dany, and then rushed back to the Iron Isles as fast as he could. Euron's speed back to the Iron Isles was probably helped by some magic, either from the Warlocks or maybe the Shrouded Lord. We know that magically strong and consistent winds exist in the world of Ice and Fire, as does teleportation. However, we've only seen the teleportation one time, while we've seen the magical winds several. And the strong winds have already been linked to the Warlocks by the other Ironborn. The point being, Euron's rapid trip back to the Iron Isles isn't that perplexing, but what is perplexing is the timing. Euron returns right after Balon Greyjoy dies. Now, for many readers, and for the Ironborn themselves, this implicates Euron as the murderer of Balon. Euron may be a horrible, horrible man, but of this crime, he's innocent. Now, one piece of evidence that Balon was murdered is that the ghost of Highheart has a vision.
I dreamt a man without a face, waiting on a bridge that swayed and swung. On his shoulder perched a drowned crow with seaweed hanging from his wings.
Now, from this vision, it seems that Balon was killed by a faceless man. So let's say that Euron hired a faceless man to kill Balon and paid for it with, say, that dragon egg that he claims he lost. Well, the first question I'd have to ask is, when did Euron have the time to hire a faceless man? Euron only gains a motive to kill Balon after he runs into Dany and her dragons. So in order to hire a faceless man, Euron would have to rush up to Braavos, hire a faceless man, and then head to the Iron Isles. Would Braavos even let such a notorious pirate into their port? But let's assume that Euron did make it to Braavos and did hire a faceless man. How did the faceless man get on the Iron Isles? Let's rewind. Back in A Clash of Kings, Theon takes a ship called the Mirri to the Iron Isles. While on this ship, he makes note of the comet. This means that Theon's trip to the Iron Isles happens roughly at the same time as Dany wandering the Red Waste. Dany has not made it to Qarth, and the world does not know about dragons yet. So during Theon's journey and before, Euron has no motive to kill Balon. But here's the thing. After Theon arrives, Balon enforces a policy of Ironborn isolationism. No ships are able to leave the island until Balon dies 6 months later. Now yes, ships are still able to come in, but after a few weeks, the merchants would catch on. No ships would be willing to enter the Iron Isles knowing they can't leave. And a new ship coming in would be awfully conspicuous. So if Balon were indeed murdered, his assassin would have to make it to the island around the time of Theon's journey or before. So this fact really exonerates Euron. He has no motive for killing Balon, yet. In fact, few people have motive for killing Balon. He hasn't attacked anyone yet. But if Euron didn't kill Balon, who killed the Squiddy King? Well, I'll just tell you, it was Jason Mallister. Very few people would want to kill Balon Greyjoy at the beginning of A Clash of Kings. He was well loved in the Iron Isles, and because Theon is a hostage of the Starks, no one thinks he can attack anyone. But then Robb decides that he's going to release Theon back to Balon. Catelyn thinks this is a horrible idea and totally calls that shit. Balon Greyjoy is not a man to be trusted. He wore a crown himself, remember, if only for a season. He may aspire to wear one again. Now Robb is blinded by his friendship with Theon, but every other Rivermen and Northmen must be thinking the exact same thing as Catelyn. Especially the Mallisters, whose seat is Seaguard. Seaguard was attacked in the Greyjoy Rebellion, and Seaguard is actually short for Seaguard against those motherfucking Ironborn. Jon Snow makes a note of the bone-deep mistrust between the Mallisters and the Ironborn, and when Theon tries to befriend Jason Mallister's son Patrick, Jason tells Patrick to get the fuck away from Theon. Now, considering that it's common sentiment to not trust Balon Greyjoy, and considering that the primary duty of Seaguard is to defend against Ironborn, it would seem that the Mallisters would have to do something about this Theon issue. In fact, it would almost be incompetent for them not to. And sure enough, the Mallisters are suspicious as hell. At the start of the War of the Five Kings, fighting breaks out in the southern Riverlands. Seaguard, on the other hand, is not touched by war. And yet Jason Mallister requests leave to go home and defend his homeland. Why? What good is going home to Seaguard? Well, as a result of going home to Seaguard, Jason Mallister gets to escort Theon to the sea. He also gets to arrange Theon's transport to the Iron Isles aboard the Mirri. Now, the Mirri is allegedly a trading ship out of Old Town, but it's very clear that they serve the Mallisters. There are far too many things about the Mirraham that just don't make sense. The Mirraham is a trading ship, and yet the daughter has never seen the Iron Isles. It's pretty ridiculous that a trader's daughter would have never seen the Iron Isles, but it's even more ridiculous when you look at geography. Coming from Old Town, you practically run into the Iron Isles on the way to Seaguard. On top of that, Theon thinks it's pretty weird that she's a virgin for her age, and pretty weird that she goes to bed with him so easily. Not to mention, Theon is an absolute jerk and describes the Iron Isles as a hellhole, and yet she begs Theon to take her with him. Was the trader's daughter trying to be a spy? Now, the Mirraham gets stuck in the Iron Isles for 6 months because of Balon's order for isolation. When they finally get released, rather than going to Old Town, they go back to Seaguard. Why? What's in Seaguard for them? In fact, the captain of the Mirraham even goes one further. He travels from Seaguard to a town called Hag's Mire just to meet Robb. There seems to be no reason why a simple trader would ever do this. Now, of course, the Mirraham's news that Balon is dead and Euron has returned changes Robb's plans completely. He now thinks he has a chance of taking Moat Cailin. So while many people think it's an awfully big coincidence that Euron returned to the Iron Isles the day after Balon died, it's just as fortuitous that Moat Cailin would become weakened just as Robb turned his armies north. It seems very likely that House Mallister, in all their mistrust of the Greyjoys, would put an assassin aboard the Mirraham in case something went wrong. In fact, something going wrong was expected. Catelyn saw it from 1,000,000 miles away. And so naturally, if House Mallister were going to take out Balon Greyjoy, they would do it at the most opportune moment. And so they did, right before Robb was to take Moat Cailin. Now it should be noted that to pull this off at the right time, the Mallisters would probably need the complicity of the Greyjoy Maester. Now, I did an entire series on the Maesters called Dragonless Ambitions. Old Town is definitely meddling in the affairs of the Iron Isles, especially with House Blacktide and the Alliance of the Reasonable. Now, we know very little about the Greyjoy Maester. The only thing we really know about him is that he informed Balon's wife of his death, and however the message was worded, it instantly made all of House Harlaw suspect Euron of murder. Something does seem to be fishy between House Mallister and Maester Wendemere. House Mallister sends extra ravens to Pike, even though Robb has already sent some. These ravens were supposedly sent because Robb's might be lost, but I think at this point it's safe to assume that something sneaky was in those messages. Now what's also interesting is that Theon likely got the trader's daughter pregnant. Much later in Old Town, Samwell actually spots a young mother hanging out with some acolytes and a maester. We're not sure if it's the same woman, or what the hell maesters would be doing with Theon's bastard son, but it's interesting nonetheless. Do the Hightowers hope they have a potential heir to the Iron Throne? Or are they just interested in Kingsblood? Now, just to confuse the issue a little more, it should be noted that Aeron Greyjoy did note that Balon's health was deteriorating quickly. So rather than bringing an assassin in on the Mirraham, it may be that the Mallisters just asked Maester Wendemere to kill Balon, and then Wendemere wrote a suspicious letter to blame it all on Euron. It all seems a lot easier and cheaper than a faceless man. But if it were just a regular assassin or a maester, what the hell is the Ghost of High Heart talking about? Now I'd like to point out that the Ghost of High Heart sees in her vision a drowned crow. Now at first this seems like Euron because he's the crow's eye and drowned men are associated with the Ironborn. But Euron actually doesn't follow the drowned god. This crow seems to be the titular crow from the title A Feast for Crows. Both Roderick the Reader and Euron talk about the Ironborn as crows that will feast on the body of Westeros. So this crow represents the Ironborn in general. It's a feaster, not a murderer. And while this man without a face initially sounds like a faceless man, he may just be an assassin, or a maester, or the embodiment of death. And when you think about it, Euron doesn't really have that much of a motive to kill Balon. Let's keep in mind that Euron doesn't really care about the Iron Islands. He lets Victarion have them. What he wants is the Iron Fleet. So let's imagine for a moment that Balon was alive when Euron came home. Not much changes. Euron still does his Dragonhorn pitch, but this time it's to Balon. And considering how well it went at the Kingsmoot, there's a good chance that Balon would bite as well. Meanwhile, without Balon's death, what are Robb's options? A skeleton crew at Moat Cailin held off thousands of Bolton forces. Had Victarion not left, there's no way that Moat Cailin would have fallen. And the Mallisters specifically say they only have 8 ships. The Northerners were out of options. They needed to kill Balon. So in summary, it seems that it was the Mallisters that killed Balon and not Euron. They had a bone-deep mistrust of the Ironborn, and knew about Theon's return before Ironborn isolation. Jason Mallister's return to Seaguard, his extra ravens, and his connection with the Mirraham make him awfully fishy, and the Mallister and Northmen benefit from Balon's death is critical. So it seems the Mallisters killed the Squiddy King. The real question is, was there complicity from the Alliance of the Reasonable? We'll talk about that along with Euron's arrival in Part 5.